All right. We have with us Simon Prentis.
Hiya.
Simon, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
So you've recently you've worked as a translator. You've translated for Japanese between Western cultures and Japanese cultures. And that's sort of where you started. And that inspired you to write your recent publication, Speech, How Language Made Us Human.
Right.
So how long has this book been in the works for?
I would say 30 years. Because I kind of talk about it in the introduction to the book, but I went to Japan. I was drawn to Japan because I was studying a thing called Aikido, which is a martial art. And I went there originally thinking I'll spend a year there, figure it all out, and come back home and do whatever else I was going to do, which I hadn't really figured out at all. But still, I ended up staying in Japan. And then one thing led to another, and I realized that I could make a living out of translation and interpreting, which are two different things, really. Interpreting is the spoken thing, and translation is the written thing. But it was really my experiences as an interpreter that started me thinking about writing, because I would find myself caught between two different worlds, if you like, because on the one hand, you're having a conversation with one set of people who are in their world and you understand their world, and then you switch around to another set of people who are having their conversations in their world, which is, they're two mutually exclusive worlds to the two parties, and you mysteriously have the key to both worlds. And you can sort of see what's going on, and they're both kind of equally suspicious of each other, and they think that the other side is kind of weird because they do that stuff or think that way, and you think, well, what is it? You both guys are thinking the same weird stuff about each other. That's a bit crazy, isn't it? So I thought, I wanted to write about that. I just wanted to kind of show up the absurdity of how we all tend to be very suspicious of things that we're not familiar with. And so particularly at that time, the people in the West used to talk about the Far East. I'm not sure we really talk about the Far East anymore, but at the time we did, especially my parents' generation. And I just thought, you know what, from a Japanese perspective, looking at the West, it looks like the Far West. I mean, these guys, they're crazy. They're off the scale the other way. So my original idea was to write a book called Far East, Far West. That was just kind of throw up the contrast between the two. And then one thing led to another. I got busy, and I could never really quite sort of come up with what the final shape of it was going to be like. It was just like a set of stories, and that didn't ever feel like enough. So one thing led to another, and I began to think about language in a slightly sort of deeper way, and not see it as two separate things, but as a much bigger picture. What are we doing when we speak language? What's actually going on, and why does it tend to make us feel this way? Why do we get stuck into our own little world and think that that's the one that's the the right way of doing things, and everything else is wrong and all that? I mean, it's like individuals in a way are like that too, but culturally speaking, it's a much sort of bigger picture. So I thought, okay, I want to sort of expand on that and make that a more general point than being something about just Japan and England. Also, I was working at that point. I started to work in other countries too, because clients would say to me, can you come with us to other places so that we can. So I was often working through other interpreters. So I was dealing with other cultures as well. It wasn't just English and Japanese. It was looking at the Middle East, Europe, and other parts of the world. And so then that became a much more general thing. So at one point the working title of the book was Same Shit, Different Bucket, which was an Australian expression that some guy told me one time. He said, "Oh, that's what we say. Yeah, I got it. Same shit, different bucket." And I was like, okay. But then it became what it is now.
And when I was reading your book, it was what came to mind is the German language, and how there's very specific words for kind of nuanced things, like, for example, Zeitgeist or Schadenfreude, which I'm probably not saying that word right, but Zeitgeist describing the nature of the culture at this period of time, sort of the idiosyncrasies of
Spirit
it.
of the time is what it means. Zeitgeist.
Yeah.
Zeit is time, and Geist is spirit. So it's, you know.
But what I loved about what you said is that, you know, in our culture, we might say, "Oh, is there a word for that in your language?" And of course there is. It's we're only limited to what we're able to think. It's not that we're necessarily limited by language.
Yeah. And it's also that, you know, we tend to think, if we're not really had much experience with other languages, you tend to think, oh well, let's just look it up in the dictionary, because whatever that word is, there'll be a word for it in the dictionary. But that's very rarely the case, you know, because languages are structured differently. So they don't necessarily, I mean, even a word like water, I mentioned this in the book, but water, you think that's got to be pretty standard across the world. We all need water. It's one of the most important things to human life. But in Japanese, for example, there's two words for water. The standard word means, it's mizu, it means cold water, and only cold water. So if I want hot water, there's another word for that. It's not hot water, it's oyu, which means hot water only. So they have two different words for it. Now that probably seems weird, but then again, in English we have words where we have 2 or 3 different words. Like, for example, customer, passenger, guest, visitor. Those words are all the same word in Japanese. Okyakusan. You know, they don't sort of discriminate. They could do, but they don't normally. So each language has got a different way of slicing things up. And
right.
You can always say what you want to say, but you may not say it in the same way, if you see what I mean.
So the one thing that was really fascinating is how language has evolved over time. And you talk about in the intro of the book, the one thing that the Bible got right was, in the beginning there was the Word.
Yeah.
So how has language evolved? I mean, you think about dogs, for example, like in my backyard, my dog will bark at the other dog in the neighbor's yard. I have no idea what it is that they're saying, but my hunch is that they're yes.
Your hunch is what?
My hunch is they're communicating. You know, they're saying something, but really, what language is it sounds that we agree on the meaning of them. Like there's so many hidden agreements in language. When you really sort of deconstruct, do the whole reductionist thing on it, it's like, whoa, language is so, but it's almost like breathing. Like you say, it's so much of it is involuntary, the agreements of it, that, you know, if we really stop and think, oh my God, like, you know, how my body works, but you can't, do as you think as you may, you can't stop breathing, right? Do as you may, you can't stop communicating.
Correct.
So how has language evolved over time? Like,
well,
tell us about the story of it. Yeah.
Well, that's the big question. And then the extraordinary thing is that we don't really know yet. I mean, officially, we don't know. If you look in the language textbooks, nobody actually has an answer. Even Noam Chomsky, who is, like, you know, the great linguist, he says we don't know. It's the great mystery. So what we do know, however, is that when you look at the way your dog is communicating, for example, when a dog is barking, you can have all kinds of different tones of barking, but it's a bark, you know. So it'll be like a fuck off bark. I can say that on camera, or you know, a cute bark, but it's a bark, and the bark is not divided up into bits of sound that can be chopped up and changed. Now, the thing about language is that it's made up of vowels and consonants, to use the term that most people understand. Linguists call that phonemes. You know, they just mean they're individual sounds that can be switched up. I mean, just take dog and God, for example. You know, dot, d, o, g. If you put them the other way around, it's g, o, d, and it's two completely different meanings, but it's actually the same sounds. But because we do that, we can make as many noises as we like. We can. It's like numbers. I use the example of numbers a lot. You've just got 10 numbers, 1 or 0, counting 0 to 9, just 10 digits. And by mixing those up, you can say any number you like. You know, the longest number you want. You know, or let's say, you know, 170,433 or something. That is a long number. If you just imagine you had a different noise for each of those numbers along the way, you get lost about sort of 25. Right. But because it's a system, you can remember them. Now, it's the same with words. Words are made up of noises, just a small group of noises. And we use those just like digits, just like numbers, to make words. Every word that you say is just a combination of a very small number of noises. And that's why we can make lots of noises. Now, no animals do that. Well, that's not quite true. Some animals make a few little combinations, so they're kind of on the way to it. But we've cracked that as a means of doing it. Somehow we did that. Now, if you ask the linguists, they'll say, one day something happened, there was a change in the brain, and we were suddenly able to do that. And it's like, okay, what's your evidence for that? Well, we're still looking for it. We're not sure. But I'm saying that I think the crucial difference between what we do and what animals do is that we use digital noises. We just use sounds and put them together in a digital way, just like numbers. Whereas what your dog does and what a cow does or a sheep does is they just make a number of just limited noises that aren't put together. So it's like, you can go moo or
right,
or bah or something. They're just noises. They're what I would call analog sounds. But because language puts them together, then you've got lots of words. You can make plenty of words, and then it's about organizing them. So then you get grammar. Grammar comes after words, but until you have words, you can't have grammar. So that's it. Sorry, that's possibly a bit too much information.
No, I mean, I love it because I think I make jokes about how, primitive man, primitive people communicated. Yeah. And, surely like we put a politically, sociologically speaking, we put a huge emphasis on the individual nowadays. But in order to have gotten to this point where we are in society, there had to be a high degree of cooperation and competition, but let's just focus on cooperation. And that's language. When you and I communicate, this whole conversation is an agreement. Even if we're not agreeing in what we're saying, we're still agreeing on the words we're using. Because in order for me to be offended, I have to agree with the words that you're saying. Like there has to be a response. Yeah. So I wonder, like you say, like was it a moment or was it a gradual evolution? You talk about the 4.5 billion years or 3.5 billion years that it took us to get to this point. But I wonder about the grunts, like when we were together, saber-toothed tiger over there, surely we had to communicate, like, the difference between and like, like there had to be some level of sophistication because like you say, I think that language is what allowed us to develop stories, as Yuval Noah Harari discusses. Yeah. And it was from the stories using grammar that boom, we're able to share our ideas.
So the question is, how do we get to that point? Now, in Sapiens, he says there were three great sort of revolutions. There was the cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution, and the scientific revolution. That's kind of the core structure of that book. And so he starts out saying, about 70,000 years ago, there was a cognitive revolution. And then we had language, and then we could tell stories. And you think, okay, good. What was the cognitive revolution then? How did that happen? Well, I don't know, but it just happened, And then you think, that can't be right. It could be right, but there's absolutely no evidence for it. And secondly, how would that work? Whereas what we do know about language is that it uses sounds in just the same way as every other animal uses sound. But to go back to your scenario with the saber-toothed tiger, other animals already use warning signals. We know that, although we're not we haven't spent enough time looking yet because we haven't really dedicated the resources to it. But we know that certain monkeys, for example, will use different sounds that mean an eagle or a snake or a leopard. You know, it's the classic one, the vervet monkeys. So they use 3 sounds that are understandable by that tribe, you know, by that species, that are not understandable by other animals. So they're like random noises that mean certain things. So it's part of their culture. But they haven't got any more noises than that to talk about, like, you know, what the score was in the game the other day between the leopards and the tigers or whatever. It just sort of, they don't have enough range to do that. And the reason they don't have enough range to do it is because they haven't put sounds together to be able to make more sounds. That's what I'm calling the process of digitization. It's just about putting numbers together. If you've got like 2 sounds, ah and ee, let's say, right? Now, if you said ah means snake and ee means tiger, let's just say. Now you could actually use those 2 sounds to make 4 sounds. You could say ah means sandwich, and ee means sex, and ah means ice cream, and means dog, for example. Do you see what I'm saying? So just with 2 sounds, you actually have the potential to make a whole bunch more if you just simply combine them like that. So then if you have 3 sounds and you do the same thing, then suddenly you've got 27 words, and if you've got 4 sounds, you've got 64. And it's the magic of maths, is just about making that initial step, and boom, you're off.
And I think too that there's the importance of perception. So if I'm making the and I'm pointing at a tree, you're like, oh, that's a tree, you know, like it's so cool when you go to a foreign country, or excuse me, a different country, and you're trying to communicate. Like, talk about using your executive functioning, right? Using other parts of your brain, and you're trying to communicate, and you're looking like an idiot, and you're like, you know, and you, what do you use? You're using hand signals most of the time, right?
Right.
So I wonder what came first, speech or consciousness? Because again, in order to sort of explain things, it's like we have to know what that thing is.
Sure. We do indeed. Well, I go into that in chapter 4, I believe, of the book, because I make a distinction between awareness and consciousness, right?
Okay.
Now, you know, there's been this huge debate forever about, are animals conscious, you know? Are they sentient beings or what? In fact, I think in the British Parliament, just in the last year, they have passed a law saying that officially animals are now conscious, whereas up to now they weren't. I mean,
how humanitarian.
Well, how very convenient, actually, you know, seeing as we eat animals, you know, it's rather good to think that they probably don't feel anything, you know, like when you're fishing and the fish is jerking around on the line, it's okay, it doesn't feel anything, you know, it's kind of convenient. So I think that anybody who's ever had anything to do with animals, and you have a dog, so you know about animals, I mean, the idea that they're not aware of things is laughable.
Yes.
They are aware of stuff, you know, I mean, dogs, they even understand past and future to a certain extent. You know, they know when it's time to eat something, and they want, you know, they can see that they want to go out for a walk, you know, and they have to try and communicate that to you somehow, which they will have their way of doing. And they remember, you know, if you've sort of beaten a dog up for doing something in the past, and then you show them that thing again, they'll go, whoa, you know, so they clearly have an awareness. But I think what happens with language is that because it allows us to tag the awareness that we have with a noise, then I can say to you, toe, and you know exactly what I mean, because it's a word that we've agreed on the meaning with. Right. So now we can be conscious of a toe, whereas before you knew you had a toe, but you maybe didn't know what it was called. So to me, there is a distinction to be made between awareness and consciousness. And consciousness is just about, have you actually been able to separate it, you know, from just an instinctive awareness? I mean, just think of, I don't know, architecture. Okay, this is some might seem a weird thing, but when I went to Japan, first off, I'd obviously grown up in my own country, and you know there are old buildings around all the time, and I'd never looked at them. You know, it was just like that was just what was around me. And I went to Japan, and the first kind of 2 or 3 years I was there, I was thinking, there's something different about this place. I can't put my finger on it. Then one day I realized that there weren't any buildings that hadn't been built previous to during the previous generation's lifetime. In other words, everything had been burnt down in Tokyo.
Right.
Everything was modern. There were no old buildings. Well, there were a very few, but hardly any. So then when I came back to England, I'm walking the streets of London, I'm going, oh my God, there's old buildings everywhere. How old's that one? And how old's that one? And then gradually you start to learn that that's a Tudor building, and that's a Georgian building, and that's a Victorian building. And suddenly I'm conscious of it, right? It's not that I wasn't aware of it. I'd seen it. I knew the buildings were there. I'd just never been conscious of them before.
Yeah. It was like the forest of the trees kind of thing. Now you're seeing the individual trees.
Exactly.
Right.
So that's the function of language. I mean, just again, think about babies. Think about yourself. You don't remember, but I mean, that's what happens if you watch a little baby, how they grasp it. You know, they're just becoming conscious. You know, they're aware, but they're not conscious. Language is what brings consciousness in. That is my way of thinking of it, anyway.
And you bring up children, and I have a young daughter, 21 months, and I'm starting to see language, and it's so cool. It's amazing, right? Because a lot of language is conditioning too, right? And conditioning. Are you saying that conditioning? Or correct me if I'm wrong. What I'm hearing is that awareness is based around conditioning, right? So, for example, with the dog, if your dog jumps up on the table and does something, you're like, hey, right? It's being conditioned. Oh, don't do that.
Yes.
Whereas consciousness, again, what I'm hearing is it's more abstract. It's this sort of being able to think outside of your frame of reference, kind of like with the Tudors. Tudor architecture was way before our time, right? Postmodernism is our time. These kind of ideas is you get a sense that times have happened before, so that things have been built upon other things. Whereas the awareness piece it's sort of like as you're going.
I think of it more in terms of instinct, if you like. I mean, you sort of awareness is just perception. You can see, and you do see, and you can feel, and you can all your senses. The 5 senses are, all animals have those, and some of them have a lot better than us. Some animals can see a lot better, some can smell a lot better. They're actually much more finely tuned in terms of their awareness, their raw awareness. Like the ability, like a dog can smell however much it can, like 1,000 yards away, it can smell something. We can't do that, so our awareness is limited, but we may be more conscious of what we can smell because we can describe different parts of it in a way that the dog will just instinctively go, he can smell whatever the thing is that he's after, but he might not be able to describe or even be conscious of what it is. He just knows that's what he wants. Food, going for it, So to me, it's about becoming aware that you're aware. That's
consciousness.
Yeah, that's consciousness. That's how I'm defining it. And having the words to think about it is actually a huge part of that process.
Well, that's kind of the other piece. It's
also the trap, of course, because you get trapped into the words.
Right. Like, did our ability to speak things kind of, like I say, did that create our consciousness? I mean, you were talking about senses before.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes,
yeah.
I believe that is the case. I believe that is the greatest gift of words is consciousness. Yes. I know. That's a bit of.
You have to let me digest that for a second.
I know.
Oh, man.
Well, I think if you look at my book, page 106 and 107 of the actual book itself.
Yeah.
Are the most crucial pages in the book.
Which is free on Kindle. Free on Kindle, by the way.
Unfortunately, Kindle won't allow me to deliver the thrill that you will get through the actual book, because page 106 and 107 have something on them that is just so mind-blowing that Kindle can't deal with it.
Well,
and I can't think what it is, but it is the crux of that biscuit, exactly what you just said. you need a moment to dwell on it, and that is what page 106 and 107 deliver for you.
Wow.
I'm going to have to leave that for the viewers here.
I know, I love it. I love cliffhangers, you know, the thirst for knowledge. And I think too that I mean, we're going off on a different tangent in terms of education and awareness, understanding. There's a difference between me telling you something and a person experiencing it and getting it for themselves, right? I mean,
sure. Absolutely.
That's the essence of being a teenager, of an adolescent. Now, the other thing you mentioned is, yes, dogs have heightened senses.
Yes.
Is communication, like, there's 5 senses, you know, smell, taste, sound, sight, touch. Did I miss it? Yeah. Anyways, so these are the 5 senses.
Taste. Yeah.
Adding them all together, does that create communication? I mean, because we know that if, for example, if I lose my vision, my other senses are amplified, or so that's said. I've never obviously experienced that, but that's what I've heard.
You should try walking around blindfold for a while.
Yeah, well,
that you're hearing. In fact, I was talking to somebody just the other day who was saying that. Let me see if I can remember where this was. It was an idea that came up about the function of dreaming. That dreaming is to actually stop because when you're asleep, your eyes are obviously not receiving information. So in order to keep your brain from prioritizing your other senses, your brain creates a dream world so that you're actually seeing something in your head, so that your mind is still focused on the visual. Because if you stopped any visual input, then your brain would start diverting to your other senses, principally your ears, probably. But, you know, because when blind people walk down the street, they're actually in many ways seeing something from the sound. The soundscape actually gives them a
echolocation almost.
Yeah, totally. Yes. Yeah. So I've lost the thread of where we were on that one, but that was. Oh yeah, the idea of communication, and that our senses, the 5 senses, are communication. Well, they're all channels of communication, or they can be channels of communication, but words allow you to be so much more precise about what you're communicating, you know, because if you and I stopped using English here, if I started speaking Japanese to you, we'd suddenly have a lot more trouble. We could, you know, if we were just going gestures. だから日本語に切り替えてもう日本語で話し出したらもうちょっと難しいでしょ。僕の方では全然問題がないけれども、ロブはやっぱり困ってるんじゃない？You see, I know what I was saying, but you have no idea at all.
What were you saying? I'm going to take a guess and say if I spoke in Japanese, you wouldn't understand me. Is that what you're saying?
That's pretty much what I was saying.
That was just a really good guess. I'm going to be honest.
In fact, say something completely different. Then do you want me to try that?
Yeah. Well, now you're bringing up a good point, because as in my profession, I work with all kinds of different cultures, and this is a big part in your book. Is the 3 gods? There's culture, religion, and identity. Okay, and we'll get back to that. But as I've worked with many different cultures, and different cultures have different perspectives on things like mental health. Yeah. It's very interesting because there will be an interpreter, because translator is for the written word, interpreters for spoken word. So there will be an interpreter, and I'll be explaining, you know, say the student's struggling with their behaviors, and mom's there, and mom is fluent in Korean, learning language in English. So anyways, as I'm explaining to the interpreter, he's listening, and then mom's listening, and then he'll get it, and then he'll explain it to her, and then you gradually see as she understands what I'm saying. And it's a very powerful moment, because sometimes what I'm saying can be very hard for parents to digest. And you see, I can't even put my finger on it.
Melting of the understanding, right? There's sort
you
of like
see it happen. Like, I've already said what I've said, but you see, it's almost like it's like an out of body experience, right? Because I've already delivered my message. Now it's being delivered again, and I see how the message is being received. And maybe it's sadness, maybe it's frustration, but you see as a person begins to understand.
Right. Right.
And I think that, you know, for somebody who hasn't had that experience of working with an interpreter between two cultures, it's hard. It's really hard to define. But when you do that, you start to see just how powerful language is.
You see, and now you're becoming conscious of that. So that's a conscious element that you're adding to your own sort of armor, if you like, of being able to deal with the world, because you understand that. Because in actual fact, what we're doing when we're talking, just you and I, even though we're using what we would consider our native language, it's still a translation. You know, I'm feeling something, and I'm thinking, how am I going to say this to Rob? What's the best way of saying this? And for most of our lives, we're totally automatic on that. You know, and some of us find it more easy to express ourselves than others. You know, and it depends what we're talking about. You know, as well, but it's always a process of translation. You know, we don't see it as that, but it actually is a process of translation.
Yeah, and I mean, Socrates said ideas have consequences, right? But when I was a snobby-nosed, smart-ass kid, I was like, well, yeah, ideas have consequences, but it's the words that have the outcome. And because, you know, we could just keep our ideas in our own heads, but until we speak something, you know, that's when we can get a reaction. Although I do tell cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, talks about how thoughts and feelings are connected.
Right.
And I do think that we all have an internal dialogue, right? Like I have an internal, we speak to ourselves. I know that sounds slightly schizophrenic.
Of course, no, we do.
Right. Now,
words are wise men's counters. Do you know that one? Thomas Hobbes, he was an English philosopher from the 17th century. He said,
"Oh yes, Leviathan.
Words are words are wise men's counters. They do but reckon with them, but they are the money of fools." So it's sort of like, but the point is, you do need words to reckon with. In a way, you need to be able to sort of reckon means calculate. So you're using words in your head to try and sort of work out what you're thinking. Without those words, it would be hard to do that.
I think too that, you know, on Hobbes, because I am a fan of Hobbes. I mean, like I you know, we're all eclectics. We're all building off of other philosophies. But he talked about social contractualism, right?
Okay.
This idea that without the agreements that we've made, without the systems that we put in place, life is nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
And I think that speech, I mean, I'm ping ponging it back after what you're telling me. I think speech is the genesis of order in our society.
8. I haven't gotten there yet. That's the trajectory of the book, because the book starts with chapter 1, what is language? What's actually going on here? What are the nuts and bolts of language? Chapter 2, what is the first consequence of language? And the answer is culture. Not in the sort of artsy culture sense, just the culture, the way in which we live. How do we do things? You know, because as soon as we can talk, we have to decide, well, how are we going to do this thing that we want to do? What's the best way of doing it? How are we going to do it? We're going to do it this way. Good. Then, you know, you get into why. What the hell? Why are we doing it? Why is anything happening? And that's your immediate solution to that seems to be some kind of religious solution. If you go back into history, you know, whether it's an animist thing, it's like, oh, there are gods everywhere. We need to be careful. We need to placate this, that. And, you know, there's a whole sort of culture around religion. And then that in turn becomes an identity issue. You know, each of it, we become, you know, associated with a particular culture and religion, then that's our identity. But as, you know, in the subtitle of chapter 4 on identity, there's this great quote from this woman called Estee Martin, who apparently is a radio show host in Florida. And the quote is, "Identity is theft of the self." And I think that is just a really brilliant quote, because it means to the extent that you identify with something, you are disidentifying with yourself. You know, you're saying, I am that thing. I am, you know, whatever. And obviously there are times where that's very important for a group to have a sense of identity. But on the individual level, if we're talking about maximizing our own personal consciousness and what it means to be ourselves, then identity is the theft of the self. It actually gets in the way. So just sort of carrying on the theme, and I will come back to your order points. So those are the three gods. There's culture, religion, and identity. And all those things in their own way are traps, because we get trapped into our own particular, the culture that we happen to have been born into tells us this is the right way to do it, and this is how you should be doing it. And then suddenly we're all fighting over some kind of
that our trap is the best
idea. Yeah, exactly that. So then how do you get out of that? Chapter 5 suggests some of the antidotes, that the kind of things that we're instinctively drawn to that allow us to break through some of those the problems that come with culture, religion, and identity. I'm not saying that any of those things are bad. They're all extremely important in the process of developing consciousness, because culture is how we develop consciousness. But you need to be able to step back from it as well. So chapter 5 is the antidotes. In a word, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But let's not go into that too much here. And then, what else can we do with language? How do we find something that is actually, reliable within language? And the whole story of science, if you like, about how do we work out who we are, where we are, what's going on? What is the process by which we can actually come to some kind of reliable understanding of things? So chapter 6 deals with the sort of how we went from thinking that we were like at the middle of God's creation and that was it, and there was just like the stars around us, and we're surrounded by the angels in heaven. And every single culture in the world, whether it's the Aboriginals of America, of Australia, or wherever, it's sort of, we always thought we were the center of the world, and then we gradually found that we weren't. So that whole process is the next step up of language is how do we really find out what's going on? And then how do we store all that knowledge? How do we transmit it? What are the ways of doing it? If we're just me and you talking, then you might remember it, or you'll half remember it, or I will forget what you said. And it disappears as soon as we stop talking. But now look at this thing. Not only are we like 5,000 miles apart, this moment in time is being preserved for posterity through some mechanical means so that other people can look at it. It's just the most incredible thing. Right. So you've got, like, from speech to writing to printing to the internet, that whole kind of technical progress of actually allowing us to store and communicate knowledge is just an amazing thing that is increasingly, I mean, now, like with an iPhone or whatever, you can just, anything I want to know about anything, I can find out. If I know to ask the right question, I can find the answer in like seconds. I mean, just even from when I was a kid, that's just an impossible dream. It's just, amazing. So now finally, drum roll, chapter 8, what are we doing with this? Words are about coming up with agreements. That's really what language is about. And what have we signed up to? What have we agreed to do? And why aren't we doing it? Is really the point. So I'm just now looking at the way the world is internationally, and we're sort of like kind of trying to figure out ways of dealing with problems that are now so big that no one country can deal with it. I mean, we're all on that page now. I mean, climate change, whatever you think about it, who caused it, whatever, it seems to be happening, and we need to try and do something about it. But no one country can do that. We've got to agree on that. We've got to find some way of deciding how we deal with that. Then economic issues, international companies that are just dodging around and dodging tax and so forth. You can only deal with that at an international level. So what's the forum for doing that? Well, there isn't really one. I mean, there's a sort of United Nations, but who ever heard of the United Nations these days? But actually, the United Nations is an agreement that was made 60, 70 years ago now, and we've all signed up to it, but we're not doing it. So what's going on here? We actually signed up to it. Do you know the famous, Martin Luther King speech, I Have a Dream? Mm-hmm. You must know that one. Yeah, he came in the 60s. He went to Washington and said, I have a dream.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you know that before he said those words, there was a little preamble for that speech. And he said, I've come to Washington to cash a check. I hold in my hand a check that was issued to me by the United States government. It's called the Constitution, and it says that all people should be treated equal. This is a legal contract. You have signed off on this, and you're not doing it. Why not? Now, I think the next phase, the next stage for that is to say, we've signed off on an agreement. It's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Charter. We have all agreed that we will work to maintain international peace and security. That is the purpose of the United Nations.
Yeah.
So I hold a check in my hand. It's called those things. I want to know why we're not doing it. We've agreed to do it, you know, and nobody's talking about it. So that's the final stage of the book.
Well, and oh man, I mean, so many. And another big one too is that when talking about the future, I can't help but think about, you know, there's Star Wars, there's Star Trek, and Star Trek does a lot of beautiful things, especially with language, because you have all these different cultures with all these different language. You know, there's Klingon, there's Vulcan and stuff, but because they have like a little piece in their ear, they're able to understand each other through their cultural language, ethno lens, right? And I think that that's a brilliant piece, because yesterday, as I was reading your book, I was with a classroom, and I was with this like advanced class. Okay. And I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna throw some speedballs at these guys, because I might not get their math, but you know, I could probably level with them in philosophy. And I said, if we could all speak a universal language, would that be the end of conflict? If we had a universal, like I knew what you were saying. Remember back when you were speaking Japanese, I knew that, and I understood that, and I understood the cultures and the customs, and I trusted it. Would that be the end of conflict? Because nowadays in conversations, people say things like, if I don't get a pronoun right, I'm just using this as an example. People are offended, right? Sure. And it's like, okay, but my goal isn't to offend you. My goal is to understand you.
Correct.
And I think that therein kind of lies the problem, is that we're appealing to our emotions, but we're not necessarily understanding what it is that we're after. Because let's face it, there's wolves out there in the world that will tear us apart regardless of what God we bow to, right? Yeah. But when I'm asking questions about
what language we speak,
like when we're trying to understand each other, can we get to a point where we won't just cancel each other, but we can have real conversations and I do believe real progress? Like, is that what's limiting us? Is our appeal to our emotions?
Well, I mean, I think we're never going to get rid of conflict, because that's, of course, you know, that is part of the human condition. It's part of the animal condition. It's part of, you know, we all competing for limited resources, be that time, be it food, be it whatever, where we are doing that. But then whether we speak one language or many languages, the issue is, how do we deal with conflict, you know? And for me, the big issue is about how do we stop war? Because essentially we can't have war anymore. I mean, the wars that exist around the world, they're kind of like asymmetric police operations, if I call it that. If I can call it that. You know, when America goes into Afghanistan, right? America's the biggest military force on the planet. So, but it's not actually using its military force. They haven't nuked Afghanistan, which, you know, if in any war up until the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, anytime there was a serious war, it was between two groups of people who were doing everything. No rules. It's like whatever you got, you throw it at the other side. Now we can't do that. We actually cannot do that. There is no way that China, Russia, and America can have a nuclear war. They're not going to do it. It's never going to happen, because we know that's suicide. So what do we do? Yeah, exactly. So what are we going to do? You know, we're having these kind of little chicken shit local wars around the place, and we just sit there and watch Syria go down, and you think, seriously? What are we doing here? Why is there no mechanism Because if it was within one country, if Texas kicked off, let's say, to use Texas as a random example, there would be a mechanism within the United States to deal with that. The National Guard would be down there, or whatever it was. There would be somebody coming in to stop that, and whatever issue there was that was causing it, there'd be a forum for that to be discussed. Now, there's nothing on the world stage. Well, there is, but it's not allowed, and that's the Security Council, where any issue that's happening on the world stage should be and could be discussed, and we could have a decision like, what are we going to do about this, and whose rights are involved here. But there's a thing called a veto, where Russia, China, America, Britain, or France can go veto, and if you don't like it, it doesn't happen, so it just carries on, and that's ridiculous. That is sort of the problem that stops conflict being resolved. Because if we did it like we do in our own democratic in inverted commas, but in countries where we have the rule of law, and if you and I have a bust up, right? If you and I decide that if I say you built your fence on my land, okay, get your fence off my land, and you go, no, it's my land. And I say, well, I'm going to come and smash your face in, or whatever. Sort of we might have an argument about it, but then ultimately we could get the police involved. The police would stop it, and then you and I can go to a public space and decide. Well, we can make our case, and there'll be a judge and a jury and whatever, and they will decide that I'm right or he's right, or whatever. That's it. That's the end of it. We should be able to do that at the next level up. We've agreed to do it. Why aren't we? Is the question.
It's because it's almost like these gods are fighting. Like gods are fighting.
But they're not gods. They're just
I know. But it's like with using China as the example or whatever. It's okay. Well, you guys have to do this, and it's like, well, sure, yeah, we'll do it. But then they don't do it. It's like,
it's worse than that. It's like you have the Security Council is like 15 countries that sit around. So let's take, for example, what happened recently. Yeah, controversial topic, but in Israel, there was recently this thing kicked off, right? And then, as usual, the Palestinians are firing rockets into Israel, and Israel, retaliates.
Right.
And so there was a Security Council meeting about that, and 14 countries said Israel should be required to stop doing this. And one country said, no, they shouldn't. That was the United States. They said, no, we shouldn't interfere here. The United States used its veto. So that means at that point, we can't discuss this anymore because a veto has been exercised. And the same thing happens with Syria, and Russia exercises a veto and says, we can't talk about it. It's like, what do you mean we can't talk about it? What else are we going to do?
Right, yeah.
This
is happening. Yeah.
This is happening. But because of the mechanism in the United Nations at the moment, it cannot actually do what it's supposed to do, which is absurd. Anyway, I talk about that in chapter 8 because it really ticks me off, as we say. Well, and there is actually a mechanism to get around it, but you'd have to read the book to find out. Otherwise,
I love it. I love it. You are a salesperson. Yeah, I do find that. Oh, no. Well, like with Jerry Fialka, who I see myself as a disciple of his, or I'm in training.
I noticed the writing down. That's a very Jerry trait. Jerry writes things down.
Oh yeah. Well, it's funny how I met him through Roger Steffens, who's Bob Marley's one of his chief historians.
Oh, really?
And Roger's like, you got to meet this Jerry guy. I'm like, sure, yeah. And then I look him up. Very abstract, eccentric character. Then I met this guy. I'm like, man, I love this guy. Then I realized I'm like, maybe we do have a lot in common or something. But he talked a lot about he's a huge follower of Marshall McLuhan.
Okay. Yeah, McLuhan.
And he talked about the medium is the message.
Right.
So what does that mean for speech? Because speech is the medium. What is the message?
Well, I don't necessarily sign up to the medium as the message.
Right.
I remember having a conversation with Yoko Ono once, and she said, you know, we went to see Marshall McLuhan, and I said to him, no, the message is the message. and I know what it means, in the sense that the medium is the message, is that the medium is the message is affected by the medium, depending on you know, whatever form that message is being transmitted through, that will to a certain extent affect the message. But ultimately the message is the message, you know. And in terms of language and translation and interpreting and all that, I mean,
right.
when you were using an interpreter to speak to your Korean lady, you know, you have a message, right?
Yeah.
Now, you use your medium, which is English, which doesn't work for her because she doesn't understand that medium. And then you explain it to an interpreter, and he uses her medium to explain it to her. But the end of that process is for the message to be conveyed. So although Marshall McLuhan was obviously trying to draw attention to the effect that media were having on the consciousness of the people receiving messages through the media, particularly he was talking about television and you know, sort of electronic media. Nonetheless, the message is the message.
Yes.
You know, it's what is your message is the important thing, really. You know?
Well, and I think too, like, how has technology, and in particular, let's just talk about cell phones, you know, internet usage, how has that affected communication?
Speeded it up incredibly.
But has it improved communication, or has it, like, what I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I mean, part of me, because I grew up with books and I still, you know, like to read books, and
me as well,
it sort of distresses me a little bit that my children don't read really in quite the way that you know, that they don't seem to have time to immerse themselves in a book and really kind of follow a long, complicated train of thought that is taking you in a particular way, and that you can stop along the way and think about, and that's I don't know. I'm not qualified to really say to what extent that is a, you know, an objective change that has occurred. But on the other hand, the upside of that, as I was saying earlier, is, I mean, anything that I'm thinking about, or I'm having a conversation with somebody, you know, I can think, now, what was that? And I can just look it up, boom, and I can find out immediately. That's incredible to me. I mean, right above my head up there, where am I going? Up there, there's a set of encyclopedias there, right?
Oh, yes, yeah, same, yeah.
Encyclopedia Britannica. So when I came back from Japan, I always wanted an encyclopedia as a kid, and my parents would never buy one because they're too expensive, and who wants an encyclopedia, right? So when I came back from Japan at the age of about 32, first thing I did when I made some money was to buy an encyclopedia, because that was the only thing you had back then. If you wanted to know, if you wanted to have a reference, a basic reference library, an encyclopedia was as good as it gets. You know, you just grab it down from the shelf, and any subject you need to know about, that's how you did it. Now, you know, this thing,
Wikipedia, yeah.
Whoa, it's in the palm of my hand. It's just amazing. You know? Now it's interesting. You know H.G. Wells, the writer H.G. Wells, you know, the science fiction guy, War of the Worlds, you know, Time Machine. He, in 1940 thereabouts, he wrote a book called The World Brain, and he decided he was thinking forward, and he was saying the next step in this process is to have some means where all the knowledge in the world can be connected up together, so that anybody who wants to know anything can sit down at his own desk and get like a projection of whatever it is that he needs to know about right there. This is before computers, any of that. He could see that was the next step, but he didn't know how it was going to be done. But conceptually, he understood that's what was going to happen. Now, in the lifetime of his grandchildren, that is the reality. You know, it's just amazing how fast that's happened.
And really, just in the span of, like, you know, the first iPhone came out, what, 2007?
Yeah.
And look where we are now. Like, wow, you and I communicating it right there like that.
I haven't looked at that video for 25 years.
But it looks great.
It looks great, but I mean, I don't need it.
No, of course.
it's as obsolete as,
Yeah.
as clay tablets.
What?
It's
Yeah.
amazing.
I mean, even perhaps more obsolete, because clay tablets, they hold history. I mean,
Right.
those do, but they're not like ancient,
Correct. Yeah.
So, wow. Yeah, they truly have. I mean, so again, speech has been this ability. It's this, I can't think of the word, mitochondria or whatever. It's the vessel that's allowed us to pass down or
Yeah.
pass up information.
Correct. Yes.
Throughout the ages.
Yes.
So what books, because I'm looking at the seismic hazard behind you. But I love it. I love bookshelves.
It's double bubble, as we call it in the trade. That's actually too deep, those books. It's not just one shelf.
Wow.
If you pull out a bunch of books, there's another depth behind them. So like the ones I'm looking at most are in the front, and then there's the ones behind them too. So
that's impressive. I have my bookshelf as well. You know what? That's my favorite thing in the Zoom calls is whenever, like, I hope everybody has a bookshelf in their Zoom call. And when I'm looking at them, I'm like, like, I'm not going to lie. I'm sizing them up based on their books. I see one right beside your left shoulder, and I'm pretty sure it says Freedom.
This one?
That's right. Yeah. Just down a little lower. Yeah.
That's a rubbish book.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. Well, if you can, anybody who can summarize Freedom.
It was written by it's a right-wing rant. I just got it because I wanted to understand these guys.
Yes.
So,
well, I've had conversations with the right wing as well, and it's always interesting to listen to them. Like, again, not be emotionally evoked.
But you need to understand. You need to understand where everybody's coming from. It's
absolutely,
everybody's got their little portion of the truth. But it's a question of how you deal with that.
So, what books have inspired you in your journey? I mean, your top 3 books, because you mentioned Sapiens.
Ooh.
And then you're talking about
okay. One really influential book is called Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Jared Diamond.
Yeah. I mean, that's in my own particular journey, that's quite a late comer, because that's like 1995 or something. So I'm already in my 40s at that point. So there's a really great book which is called In Pursuit of the Millennium. And it's by a British historian called Norman Combe. It was written in the 60s. And it's about millennial cults. And it starts out with, because you're old enough to remember the 2000, the fuss over the year 2000.
Yeah. Y2K bug.
That's the one, the world's going to end, all the computers are going to crash and all this stuff. Well, it turns out that there was a similar thing around the year 1000, right? The end of the 10th century, just as it was going to go from 999 to 1000. It's like, what's going to happen? This is the end of the world. And there was a whole bunch of stuff around that. So the book is a study of mostly religious groups through history who have believed that this is the end of the world, is about to come, and we need to purify ourselves and prepare for, God's second coming. And part of that means that we should all live like communal lives and help each other, and peace, love, and eternal wisdom, that kind of stuff. And it always is the same, and it always ends badly with one guy with the biggest dick having all the women and everybody else living in misery.
Yeah.
Do you remember the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh guy? The orange guy. He was in California, maybe before your time, but anyway, there was a guru from the 60s, 70s, 80s period who went to California and caused mayhem. Exactly the same thing. But that's a great book. It's a great book because it shows that everybody is trying to, not everybody, but many people sort of are looking for the perfect ideal world, and it tends to end badly because we're not organizing ourselves properly. But so anyway, that was a great book. It sticks in my head. Geez, you're putting me on the spot here. I hadn't really thought about this, but what just sort of I like, or I used to like, the ones that inspired me. I mean, something like The History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. Just something that gives you a big picture. I like, I like to I want to know the big picture first, and then you can pick and choose in the little bits in between. So, that kind of thing. Now, Guns, Germs, and Steel is a classic big picture book.
Yeah.
So Sapiens. Why?
No, well, I was going to say Sapiens was a really good one.
Yeah,
and when you're speaking about the millennium, the dawn of the millennium, I mean, it just goes to show that people are easily influenced, right? All throughout the span of history, people have been easily influenced.
Yeah.
And what do you influence people with? Language.
The false gods of culture, religion, and identity.
Right. So how do we get away from these false gods?
I think you have to find yourself. That's a very easy thing to say and a very difficult thing to do, but it's one of the great things for me of going and spending a lot of time in another culture was that it made me rethink everything I had ever thought about who I thought I was,
And your own culture, yeah.
Yes, because, and especially if you marry into that culture, and then everything, the most intimate things in your day-to-day life, you're going to come up against different assumptions. It's like, why do you do it that way? Why do you do it that way? I don't know. Doesn't everybody do it that way? No, they don't do it that way. Everybody here does it that way. It's like, so you have to kind of ask a question to every little moment of your life almost. Why are we doing it that way? Why am I doing it that way? Why? I mean, just something as very simple as, should you wear shoes in the house or not? I mean, it turns out that Anglo-Saxon culture is about one of the only cultures in the world where we just assume that, of course, you walk straight into the house with the shoes that you just tried dog shit in the street on and walk through the house. And that's absolutely fine. Most cultures around the world, including most European cultures, take their shoes off in the house because for that very reason. You don't want to tread crap into the house. So now that's if you've never thought about it, it's like, oh, so it's about really sorting out what is me and what is just automatic, because basically if you grow up in a culture, you're learning an automatic set of processes, and that's you until you realize that it isn't you, it's actually just your culture. So for me, that has been the biggest learning moment, I think, in my life is my exposure to other cultures. I don't think you necessarily need to have to do that, but it's all about just questioning things and finding, it's like, why do I do that? I know I do that. Do I like doing that? I don't know. I just do that. It's just that sort of thing. You have to kind of try and constantly step back, which is why we go back to that little saying, identity is theft of the self. It kind of is.
You know what? One thing that I've learned in my own life is that the fountain of youth is cognitive dissonance.
Hey.
Right? Like when you're doing something and then somebody's like, you do it that way? And you're like, yeah. But then they're like, well, you could do it this way.
Yeah.
Whoa, that is great. Like, work smarter, not harder is another expression. And I do agree that if there's a stat that I heard, I don't know the exact number, but I think more than half of US citizens, and I don't mean to pick on the United States, but it's just the example that I heard. More than half of the United States apparently don't have passports.
Yeah, I think I've read something like that, yes.
And I thought, like, wow, but then, of course, here's the cognitive dissonance piece. How much of the world have I really seen? I've been to lots of places in the United States, but I haven't been to anywhere in Europe or I've been to Hong Kong. But you see what I'm saying is,
yes.
But when you experience a different culture, that's when I think you actually understand yourself.
Yeah.
Here in the West, I am of Anglo-Saxon background, whatever you'd like to call it.
Yeah.
And I'm what's considered the dominant culture. But I don't really know my culture. And it wasn't until I went to Barbados which is a very different culture than my own, where I was the minority, that I really started to understand my own identity, just
Absolutely.
as you say.
Yeah.
And I think that that is a wonderful exercise. It's an exhausting exercise,
Well,
but it also puts into perspective how you interact with other cultures within your own.
Yeah, and cognitive dissonance is actually a really good point on that, I think, because that's what happens when your whole set of assumptions are challenged, and then it's like, wait a minute, now that is, it's both a challenge and an opportunity, and how you deal with that will depend, on how whether you grow or whether you don't, to a certain extent. Are you going to take on the challenge, or are you just going to refuse it? Now, when I first went to Japan, not first, but continually through my experience of living in Japan, I mean, I'm white, of Anglo-Saxon background, for want of a better term, and all that. I'm a man, and I was lucky enough to have a decent education, so I've sort of cruised through life in sort of white Anglo-Saxon world without any sense that I was in any way inferior to anybody else. It's like, I'm good. I'm sort of, I'm rolling with it. We're all good. Yeah, we're all good. And, suddenly you find yourself in a culture which has an equally sophisticated knowledge base and understanding of itself, and considers that white people are actually clumsy, barbarian, uninformed, unsophisticated, and in many ways just narrow-minded about all kinds of things. And I experienced, particularly as my Japanese improved to the point where I could have decent conversations with people, I began to notice that I was being kind of almost pitied, I think is the word, rather than looked down on. I mean, it's nothing like being an ethnic minority in the white world, which is, kind of pretty demeaning, I think, the way white people treat most sort of non-white minorities, ethnic minorities. It wasn't anything like as bad as that, but nonetheless,
it's kind of patronizing.
Yes, it is patronizing.
In the West.
But I was being patronized in a way in Japan, because I didn't know enough about Japanese culture. I didn't speak the language properly enough. Properly enough, is that the right way to say it? So it was like, oh, you're never going to understand us because, there's certain things that only Japanese people can understand, and all that. It was sort of, and it was a really, really educational experience. And I'm really glad I had that experience. It really made me understand what it's like to be looked down on, actually, in a small way. I'm not saying that it was particularly, it's not like, being black in an inner city, experience in America or here in the UK, nothing like as bad as that, but it gives you a sense of what that means, not to be in the top rank of the people who just assume that the world is theirs, and that's all this stuff I don't know about in the States, but here right now is this sort of thing about, white privilege and, and even racism itself. It's like people go, I'm not racist, and it's like, no, you aren't consciously racist, but you are actually, your behavior is unconsciously racist, because you're making all these assumptions about the way white culture is and what's best, and you're not taking into account any of the other things you don't understand, and you're not putting yourself in the position of the other people. So in effect, you are racist. I'm sorry to say it, but actually you are unconsciously racist.
Well, if you're offended by the fact that someone's saying that you have privileges, then you know what I mean? Like, it shouldn't, that's not the point, is like,
people don't
what
see
do you
it.
mean I have, exactly.
People don't see it that way. They don't even see it. It's just not
they're
there.
oblivious. They're literally oblivious to it.
We're back to awareness and consciousness, if you like. No,
Pulse,
really.
I see. I said it'd be back and forth.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting how guilo is an expression in Mandarin, correct?
Yeah. Mm.
And it's sort of a derogatory term for a Westerner, and it translates loosely as listen. And I find that so fascinating. At least when I looked it up. When I looked it up, guilo. So I could be wrong. Don't. Don't take my word for it. I'm not the authority.
My Mandarin isn't good enough to be able to correct you.
But I find that, like, that's what they're saying is listen. And I think that in our culture, at least for myself, there's this idea of, we have to get it all. We have to understand it. And if we would just listen, we might actually progress a little bit further.
But
we would benefit ourselves.
Yeah, but it's almost sort of going back to almost the self-indoctrination of your own culture. And the trap of culture is that there's a fascinating example. I mentioned it in the book, which in the jungles of South America, there's this small tribe called the Piraha. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, but it's something like that. Anyway, apparently in their language, the word that they use for themselves means straight head, right? And the word that they use for foreigners means crooked head. So in other words, we're the ones that are thinking right here. And all the others, they got it wrong. They're a crooked head,
Right,
and that perfectly encapsulates the problem. Every single culture on the world thinks
they got it.
Just like every person in the world thinks that they're right and everybody else is dumb, right? If you don't agree with me, something wrong with you, I'm afraid,
Yeah.
Unless you make an effort to step out of your comfort zone and try thinking about it, because cognitive dissonance is really what drives progress. That's what drives science.
Counterculture. Well, I was going to say counterculture is what progresses culture.
Yeah.
Right, because we're challenging it.
Just in science, it's like, how do we know that the Earth goes around the sun, not the sun goes around the Earth? How do we figure that one out? Well, we figured it out because we were looking at the way the planets were moving around, and it's like, that doesn't make any sense. It's sort of, how do we explain that? They came up with this incredibly complicated set of, interlocking spheres, like 70 different orbital things, and it was like, and then somebody said, hang on a sec, guys, if we just assume, just for the purposes of a thought experiment,
for argument's sake,
let's just say the sun was at the center and the Earth went round it, and then suddenly it would be really simple. How about that? It's like, ooh,
crucify him. Yeah.
Crucify him. And it took, a very long time to be able to actually prove it. But as a thought experiment, it worked. And so cognitive dissonance is what drives science.
And I think that that's a problem with authority, is that if it gets it wrong, then it kind of questions its integrity.
Absolutely. Totally.
I mean,
no, that's exactly it.
They laughed at Newton's laws, his theory of gravity, which is now a law, right? So in your journey as an interpreter, a translator, I mean, you've worked with Paul McCartney. Tell us a little bit about, your experiences with that. I mean, that's fascinating.
Yeah, that was really strange because just particularly in the case of Paul McCartney, I was not in that world at all, really. I had just been working when I came back to the UK from Japan, and I was qualified as an interpreter, and I could do all these, things, and I registered everywhere I could to try and just take any job that came along. And because I had been working for the advertising company that was putting together his tour in Japan, and also the TV company that was sponsoring it, these two companies came to me when his manager had apparently gone to Japan and said, listen, I don't like the interpreters that you're providing, because they were providing them with Japanese interpreters, and he just thought they weren't telling him the whole story. I don't know, I wasn't there, what can I say? But anyway, he basically said to them, listen, you find me a British interpreter who can do this, or I'm not coming back. So they went, shit, what do we do now? What do we know? And they both talked to each other, and I was the guy who was on the list because I'd just been around the block. Right. So they came to me and asked me to do it, and so I thought, okay, why not?
I was gonna say, there it is again. It's like, oh, I need a British interpreter, right? I need somebody who understands the culture.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, it worked to my favor in that respect. But suddenly, I mean, I remember that very clearly. I'd been on a shoot because I used to work in television quite a bit, and I'd just been doing a really intense 3-week shoot. And I came home on a Friday evening, and there was a message on the answer phone. Remember answer phones back in the day? And I thought I'll listen to that in the morning. And I listened to it, and it was one of those companies saying, "We have a job in Tokyo on Monday. Can you do it? Can you go to Tokyo?" And I was thinking, no way whatsoever. You know, I mean, I'm exhausted, dead beat after 3 weeks on the road. I'm not going to Tokyo on Monday. And then later in the afternoon, my phone rang, and it was the other company saying, "We've got a job in Tokyo on Monday, and it's really important. Do you think, could you possibly go?" And I thought,
"Who is this? Yeah.
What is this?" And then they said, "Oh, well, it's actually Paul McCartney's manager who needs to go and sort of sign it." And I thought, Paul McCartney's manager. Okay, all right then. So I did go, and it was quite an insight, you know, to be behind the scenes in an operation like that, because I mean, I grew up listening to Paul McCartney like everybody from my generation, and you think it just seems so distant to anything that I would ever have any possible connection to. And suddenly I'm standing backstage right behind Paul McCartney while he's playing, you know, the Golden Slumbers medley from Abbey Road. He's literally right there, and I'm right here, and I'm thinking, how the fuck did that happen? And then it's like, okay, we're off now. Simon, come on, go with Paul, take him to the bus, and then we're on the band bus after it, and it's like, whoa, why am I on the band bus? Oh, well, you're the only person who speaks Japanese, so we might need to talk to the driver or something. And say, okay, whatever. And so that was how it started, and then they liked me, I liked them, and just sort of one thing led to another, and then I ended up doing that. I think the best thing I did for him, just on a technical basis, was one day his road manager said, "Look, Paul wants to have simultaneous interpretation texted. So in other words, when he speaks English, he wants it to come out in Japanese right there and then, so people can really understand what he's saying. Because even though to a certain extent people will get what he says, because he's not really saying too many difficult things. You know, he usually just is quite simple introductions, but he just like to have that. Okay, so can you just fix that for us? You know, you've got a couple of weeks. You know, it's like, okay, you do realize that's never been done before. It's like, what do you mean it's never been done before? No, well, it's never been done before. You can't. Japanese is very complicated. You can't just type it like that. It takes, you know, it takes a lot of time to type Japanese. You can't type in real time in Japanese like you can in English.
Right.
Oh, well, yeah, well, why not? You know, it's like, well, okay, I haven't gotten long enough to explain why not. We just can't. Okay, so, well, it doesn't matter about that. You've got to do it, all right, because he's expecting that. So, so anyway, in 2 weeks, I did manage to make a system work, and it involved 6 people typing simultaneously on top of each other, and a simultaneous interpreter they would hear him speaking. She would interpret immediately, simultaneously into Japanese. I could have done it, but I was supervising, so I couldn't really do that. And then 6 people would be typing simultaneously to make it come out as a text about 3 seconds later, because, you know, with the best will in the world, you've got to have a little bit of time. So that was like, oh my God, we made it happen. But then the very first night, he comes on stage and he goes, okay, guys, we got a new system. I'm going to test it. I'm going to see how good they are. Okay, let's just try this out. So the dog slipped on the banana is what he said, right? Now that is such an English joke. You know, but the idea of anything like slipping on a banana is like, I don't even know if Americans know that particular thing, but it's like the banana joke is a very Western concept. It doesn't exist in Japanese, that image. Is so number one, that's a cultural problem. Number two, the poor interpreter, who was really, really nervous, didn't hear the dog slipped on the banana. What she heard was the dog slept on the banana. And that is what came out on the screen. In Japanese, the dog slept on the banana. And the audience went, huh? You could just sort of hear 50,000 people simultaneously going, huh? It's like, wait a sec, is that a joke? Should we laugh here? Or wait a minute, what if it isn't a joke and we laugh and then it'll be really embarrassing for everybody? So better not do anything. It's like complete silence. And McCartney goes, hey guys, what's the matter with you? It's like, oh, well,
we
never
did
mind.
What you said, boss. Wow.
So stuff like that. It was fun teaching Paul McCartney Japanese, actually, because in fact, he says he doesn't really say, I don't know if you've ever seen him play live, but he doesn't really say very much. He'll just say a few things to introduce a song. So I said, look, why don't you learn to say, we'll work together and I'll teach you how to say these little things in Japanese. So by the end of, well, how many times? I've been with him 6 times to Japan now. He can do his show in Japanese now. Because I taught him how to say things, how to remember things, and how to,
the etiquette and the mannerisms.
Well, yeah, it's more to do with remembering writing the Japanese in a way that sounds like it's English that he can remember, and it's like, well, there's a phrase. Do you want to hear some more? He likes to hear. You want to hear some more, right? So, motto kikitai so motto is like a motto, right? That you would write under a identity is the theft of the self. How about that as a motto, Paul? So a motto, and then kikitai. He said, "Oh, that sounds like kinky tie, like a kinky tie." So he writes down kinky tie, and then we just
you were Anglicanizing it for him.
Yeah. So then it's motto kikitai, and he's got a great ear.
Motto kikitai.
Really, his ear is fantastic. In fact, he told me this story. God, you have to stop me if I'm going on here, but this is such a good story. I think it's
please go on. Please go on.
I complimented him once on his ear. I said, you pick it up really fast. I know this is going to sound like I'm, arse licking, but I'm not. Seriously, I do this a lot, and you've got a great ear. I just want to say that you're fast. And he goes, oh, well, it's maybe because of me and John. We didn't have a tape recorder back in the days. No, he actually told me the story. He said, when we were writing songs, we were in the porch of my mother's house, and we couldn't write music. We didn't have a tape recorder. How do you remember the melody that you just come up with? It's almost like, writing and speech, It's like, so you come up with this great melody, but how do you record it? You can't.
Yeah.
He said we had to just repeat it over and over and over in our heads until we got it. We got really good at remembering melodies. So I guess I got a good ear. So it's like, wow, that was a connection through history. Suddenly I'm sitting in Paul McCartney's mother's porch with him and John, it's kind of just sort of, whoa, interesting.
Wow. I mean, that is, and have you met John Lennon?
No. I've worked with Yoko a lot, but no, he died before. Well, didn't die. He was killed before my time, as it were. But no, I mean, there's The next book I want to write after this one is called Talking Funny for Money.
Talking Funny for Money.
I wish I could claim ownership of that phrase, but it was actually, I think it was his guitarist who came up to me the second time I worked for him, and I just arrived in Tokyo, and he saw me and he came over and he said, "Hey Simon, you still talking funny for money?" And I thought, oh my God, that is the gift of all gifts. What a title is that? So,
Now, will that be like a memoir sort of thing?
Kind of. Just sort of, funny stories like the one I just told you, but all kind of tied in with the general overall themes of what we have been talking about, but, maybe less intensively so. I don't know. I've got a lot of material, but I don't know if I'll get writing it.
Like I was saying to you, your book, it's a profound message, but it's written in a very understandable prose. It's, because some of these books on language and syntax, linguistic books can just be like, they're not fun. like they're textbooks. You use them as a weapon in Clue or something like that. But this is a very accessible book. So I do encourage everyone to read it. It's available on Amazon.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what's now that you've published your book?
It was written for my children, not specifically for my children, but for my children's generation, which is like, late 20s, early 30s. I want it to be read by people who maybe would never read a book about language, but who, I want it to be accessible in the way that you just said. So I really, like I said, it took me 30 years to write this book, and certainly the last 5 years was about trying to make it more accessible and just sort of understandable, and no roadblocks in the way of terms that people don't understand and all that. It's just sort of try to make it as intuitively understandable as I could, and
you achieved that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Sapiens, the reason why I love that book is it blends humor and fact. It's just philosophy, and it just makes it in a way that it's very approachable, digestible. And that's certainly what you've achieved in your book, in the intro and the first chapter that I've read, just because I'm not a technocrat. I'm still figuring that out. So I couldn't figure out the Kindle thing, but
get the hard copy.
I'm going to get the hard copy. Yeah. So last question for you. 2 questions. What was your aha moment in your life? Or did you have an aha moment? What's the first one that comes to mind?
Oh my God. My very, very first aha moment that I can remember, I was still crawling and not walking, and I was in the bottom of the garden where I was born and grew up my first 5 years, and there was a kind of a bank, and I crawled up to the edge of the bank, and there was a hedge, and I poked my head through the hedge, and there's this huge, great, what turned out to be a playing field. It was just a huge, great expanse of openness. And I remember thinking, whoa, there's a big world out there. Oh my God. I must have been, I don't know, maybe I was 2, 3, something like that. And I don't know why I remember that, but I do. It was just a huge, oh my God moment. So it's like, there's a big world out there. That probably wasn't what you were expecting, but
actually that does tie into your life. I mean, you didn't stay in one place.
I did not.
You went and you explored that vast expanse, right? I mean,
as much as I could. Yeah.
Are you done traveling, or is there still more work to be done?
I mean, I still like traveling, but I mean, there's nowhere that's. I'd go into space if the opportunity presented itself. Probably not at my age, but yeah, I'm done to the. I'm more at the moment interested in making sense of my life, doing the edit. I've got enough raw material, kind of, and wherever you go, it's always raw material. It's great. I like traveling. Locally, anywhere I go, there's always something. Under the tiniest stone, there's always something. But there comes a point where you need to kind of make sense of it, and that's what this book is about. Really, for me, it's just like it's the edit.
Awesome. I'm still very much collecting samples in my own life, but
well, that's it. It's the age thing. One has to. You got to have enough material.
That's how old are your kids?
The youngest one is coming up 28, and the oldest one just turned 32. And I have a daughter who's in Japan, and she is 38 now. Yeah. So there you go.
Wow. Did they become translators or?
Nope, sadly, but that's okay. I mean, I don't believe in family businesses particularly. I think you should follow what you. I mean, my daughter is from my first marriage, and she grew up bilingually. She with her mother went to Australia and went into the school system in Australia. So although she's born in Japan, speaks Japanese as her native language, she speaks English pretty much close to native as well, but she doesn't do anything with it. That's fine. You know, I mean, I think once your children are old enough to look after themselves, then you just stand back and observe, really. Unless they have a problem, they can come to you, and basically whatever she does, that's fine. And the same with my other two kids, really. I mean, they grew up in the UK, and her mother's Japanese. We spoke Japanese at home. Sorry. Her mother and I, my phone has gone off for some reason. What's that? Okay. Sorry. So their mother and I tend to speak Japanese at home. But once they were both of school age, they just decided they weren't interested in that. And we just kind of let them. Again, we both decided it's more important for them to be themselves. You know, I don't want to force them to learn a Japanese culture that they're not interested in at this point, because it doesn't really matter. You will find your cognitive dissonance where you find it. And so I think that's more important, that you find it yourself.
Wonderful. Okay, last question. Okay. What advice do you have for listeners? I mean, you've lived a very wonderful, adventurous life. What advice do you have for listeners?
I always thought that Oscar Wilde said it best, that the worst vice of all is advice.
That's the answer right there, my friend. Figure it out.
Is read this book, because this will be the best book you read all year. How about that?
I love that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's been a pleasure. And when Talking Funny for Money comes out, I'll have to have you back on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, enjoy the rest of the book, and I hope you make it through. And yeah, let me know.
I will.
Of
course.
It was great
Thank you.